Why are second terms so disappointing, you ask? Actually, maybe you didn't think to ask it. But if you had observed second terms of presidents, you might very well ask this question. So, a refresher. The Constitution specifies no term limits on presidents. Under the Constitution as originally written, a president could win once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, as many times as he was alive to keep winning. George Washington, however, cut short that possibility by retiring after 2 terms, and that became the de facto standard. If you think you deserve a 3rd term, you must think you're better than the father of your country, George Washington, and nobody wanted to go there. Franklin Roosevelt broke the Washington rule under the strain of World War II, which was going on in Europe and Asia and appeared to be coming toward the United States. And so he persuaded voters, he persuaded himself first and his party and then voters, that what the country really needed was an experienced president, not simply a new president. And the country went along, and Roosevelt was nominated and elected a 3rd time and then a 4th time. But that cured people of the idea that a president ought to get more than 2 terms. And so in the early 1950s, Congress passed and the states ratified an amendment, the 22nd Amendment, saying that presidents get 2 terms. That's it, no more than that. Okay, so this is where we are, which means that presidents get elected once, and most of them almost immediately start thinking about a 2nd term. Now, they do this because, well, I mean, if you're a president, a lot of people like being president and the perks of the office, and everybody pays attention to you. The pay is not all that good by comparison with what a lot of people could make in the private sector, but there's only one president, so that's a pretty good deal. There's something else, and that is the historical minded of presidents, and they pretty much all become historical minded at some point. Once they get elected, first when they get elected, they're overwhelmed with all the responsibilities of office, but after a while they wander around the White House. This is where Lincoln slapped, and this is where Harry Truman did that, and this is where Dwight Eisenhower, and this is where John Kennedy's ex-com met, and all this other stuff. They realize that they're part of this very select group in American history. And they start thinking about their own place in history. And one of the things they catch on to pretty quickly is that if you want to be considered historically at the top ranks of presidents, you have to get reelected. So if you look at presidents who are considered the greatest presidents, these are presidents who got elected more than once. And that's just the way it goes. And the reason for this is, I exaggerate for my purpose here, but any idiot can get elected president, but it's only good presidents who get reelected. I'm not going to say any idiot can get elected president, but you get elected president the first time on the promises you're able to make. Are you a persuasive promiser? You get reelected, however, on the performance. Did you deliver? So a reelection is a referendum on the performance of a president. And if people had a chance to watch you in office and to evaluate what you did, and they give you a thumbs up, then all of a sudden you leap to the top ranks of presidents. Of all the presidents, the top 8 or 10 presidents are all presidents who have submitted themselves to the people as this referendum. So they've been in office and then they run for election, in most cases re-election. There are a few cases. Harry Truman was president for 3.5 years before he had to run in his own right. So his election in 1948 was not a re-election technically, but he was the incumbent and he was elected as the incumbent. So that's what I'm really talking about. So a referendum was held on Harry Truman and all these other presidents who get elected after having been in office. And the ones who get voted in this referendum, they're the ones who are at the top rankings of presidents. And those who don't, those who put themselves up for re-election and get voted down, they're condemned to spend the rest of history in this nether world of presidents who just couldn't quite cut it. And some of these presidents are pretty darn good. George H.W. Bush, George Bush the Elder. His is an overlooked presidency. There are some things that the elder George Bush did that were really important and really beneficial to the country. So he guided the United States and the world to a safe landing at the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire was breaking up, the Soviet Union itself was imploding, and it could have blown up much of the rest of the world in doing so. It didn't in no small part because George Bush knew what he was doing flying this plane to the smooth emergency landing. He also cut a deal with Congress to balance the federal budget for the first time in decades. That, perhaps as much as anything, was what contributed to his defeat when he ran for re-election in 1992, because he went back on his promise, no new taxes. And voters in his own party lost faith in him. Anyway, so he's always going to be considered, somewhere down the ranks, even though he did good stuff in office. And simply by virtue of the fact that when he put himself up for re-election, voters said, nope, we don't want you, we want somebody new. Okay, so this is all by way of background. This is why we talk about second terms. I mean, this is why presidents run for second terms. But if they really read the history books more closely, they would think twice about running for a second term. Because second terms, well, first of all, they are almost never as successful as first terms, and very often they're really unsuccessful compared to first terms. So why is this so? Well, first of all, let me demonstrate that it is so. And I'll give you an example of one that wasn't so, but would have been. Abraham Lincoln was not at all sure, even as late as the summer of 1864, that he was going to get reelected. The Civil War was not going particularly well for Union arms, and he was all prepared that he was going to be replaced in the election of 1864. It turns out that he won, and so he was reinaugurated in March of 1865, but he was assassinated just a month later. If Abraham Lincoln had survived into his second term would have been far more difficult, far less successful than his first term. And this, well, because the first term was all about winning the Civil War, the second term was about dealing with the peace after the Civil War. Something similar happened to Franklin Roosevelt, although in his case it wouldn't have been the second term, it would have been a completion of his fourth term. But Franklin Roosevelt died on the eve of victory in World War II. If he had lived through his third term, he would have had to deal with the aftermath of war, and that's always harder. Now, these are two special cases, but they point out that very often second terms have difficulties, first terms don't. But in general, second terms are when the scandals arise. The Watergate scandal of Richard Nixon's term. The Watergate scandal really emerged as part of Nixon's attempt to get a second term. He was a heavy favorite over George McGovern, the Democratic nominee, but he wanted to sweep the table. He wanted to get all 50 states. And so he authorized these various dirty tricks, surveillance of the Democratic campaign, and that was the heart of the Watergate scandal. And it was only in the second term that the scandal became apparent and Nixon was driven from office. So in Nixon's case, if Nixon had just settled for one term, or if he hadn't taken such extraordinary measures to get a second term, he might have survived his second term. But the second term was when the sky fell in on the scandal. Speaking of scandals, a decade later, Ronald Reagan's second term was swallowed up by the Iran-Contra scandal. And this was a scandal having to do with the illegal sale of American weapons to the regime in Iran and illegal support of anti-government insurgents in Nicaragua. So the administration of Ronald Reagan was caught breaking the law. And it was in Reagan's second term. Now, these two you might count as, well, it's just coincidences. Now, it's not just a coincidence. Second terms, they suffer from one thing in every case, and that is that, well, in a second term, a president is typically playing with his second team. When you get elected the first time, if you're a president, let's say you're Woodrow Wilson, you get elected in 1912, and the first Democrat to be elected in more than a decade. This nearly 2 decades. And so you have your first pick of ambitious, talented Democrats. Everybody wants to be in your administration. And so you get the best, you get the A-team, you get the first string. But they work in administration for a while. And most people who take these kind of jobs They don't want to stick around for 8 years. They want to check the box on their resume that they were Secretary of State or Undersecretary of Defense or something like this. And then they'll go out in the private sector and they'll make some money off of that. Or they'll go and run for office in their own right or something like that. They don't want to work for somebody else. They like the prestige of having had the office. And they also, the ones who follow you into office, they're motivated by your vision. So they have this ambition, this energy, they have all these ideas, and they throw themselves into making your administration successful. But it's a tough job. It's a wearing job. It can be a 14, 16-hour-a-day job, and people get burnt out. And then they go off into other jobs in the private sector and so on. And they're replaced by, well, the people who weren't your first choice. And by the time you get to your second term, well, you're at least to your second team, or your third team, or your fourth team. So that's part of it. There's something else. You've run out of ideas. People campaign for president they say, okay, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And so you try this, this, and this, and maybe you succeed, or maybe you fail, but you gave your best shot to your best policies. And by the time you get to a second term, well, people don't have 10 good ideas. If you're Thomas Edison maybe, but if you're a typical politician, you don't have 10 good ideas. And you've tried all your best ideas at first. And as I say, either you've gotten them through and now they're working, or you didn't and they're not. But in either way, you're not going to come up with this whole set of really appealing good ideas in your second term. So there's that. You're getting tired. The job wears on you. You live above the office, so you never really get away. And you've kind of lost your own vigor. In very many cases, you're at a time of life, so far we're talking about men, you're at a time of life where you're starting to slow down. Now, the youngest presidents were Theodore Roosevelt and John Kennedy, who became president in their early 40s, but typically presidents become presidents in their mid to late 50s into their 60s. And so, can be even older than that. Ronald Reagan, when he left office, he was in his mid going on late 70s. And in the case of Ronald Reagan, it was really clear that he was slowing down. He was getting forgetful. Woodrow Wilson won a second term. And in his second term, he suffered a series of strokes, finally a nearly incapacitating stroke, that basically knocked him out of a position to even conduct the ordinary affairs of the presidency for the last 18 months of his presidency. Oh, there's one other thing. And there's something that's kind of self-fulfilling about this. As I say, scandals emerge in the second term. Well, that's not all. It's usually true. And one of the reasons the scandals emerge in the second term is you're playing with the second team or the third team, and maybe they have interests other than the national interest at heart. It's no longer so exciting. You're getting tired. You're no longer willing or able to keep such close watch on them as before. But there's something else involved, and that is, should a scandal emerge in your first term, well, then you don't get a second term. And so there's, if you do get a second term, there's a greater chance there's going to be a scandal in your second term, precisely because there wasn't a scandal, not a big scandal, in your first term. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had a second term. But in any event, if you go down the list of presidents, their second terms are nowhere near as compelling as their first terms. And starting with George Washington became so disillusioned by his second term that he quit politics. John Adams didn't get a second term. Thomas Jefferson got a second term, and it was sort of preoccupied with the Embargo Act of 1807, which was one of the worst decisions a president ever made, and just blew up support for Jefferson in much of the country. And so James Madison, he fought a war. It's actually at the end of his first term, but it consumed most of his second term. And so you go down the line, Andrew Jackson in his second term got in a big fight with the Bank of the United States, and it led to a huge blow up in politics, and it ultimately led to the Panic of 1837. In the 19th century, it wasn't quite so automatic that a president would get two terms. Ulysses Grant got a second term, and the big scandals of his administration emerged during the second term. Grover Cleveland is the sole example of a president who got a second term that was not attached to the first term. So Cleveland had 2 terms, but they were non-consecutive. So some of the things about second terms don't apply there. But in the 20th century, it becomes almost automatic. So Theodore Roosevelt got what amounted in effect to a second term. Woodrow Wilson got a second term. Franklin Roosevelt got a second, third, fourth term. Harry Truman got what amounted to a second term. Dwight Eisenhower got 2 terms. John Kennedy was assassinated, but Lyndon Johnson got the rest of Kennedy's term and a term of his own. Richard Nixon got voted in twice, although he left in the middle of his second term to avoid being impeached. Ronald Reagan got 2 terms. George H.W. Bush, whom I mentioned, he was defeated. That relatively rare case of somebody who ran for a second term and was defeated, I should say. Relatively rare. Jimmy Carter did it in 1980, losing to Ronald Reagan. But then Bill Clinton got 2 terms, George W. Bush got 2 terms, Barack Obama got 2 terms. So it became the norm. But as I said, these second terms are usually, well, by the end of the second terms, presidents are usually pretty glad to get out of office. So there have been people on occasion who thought, what we ought to do? We ought to go from 2 4-year terms to 1 6-year terms. Andrew Jackson thought this would be a good idea. Just limit the president to a single term. Then the president doesn't have to worry about getting reelected. 6 years is long enough, way long enough, to get done whatever you're going to get done. And it's not a bad idea. It might be something to think about. We've gotten so wedded to the current thing that it's kind of hard to imagine it happening. But things do change over time. But in any event, should you become president one day, well, give serious thought to leaving office after 1 term. And then that raises the question, so do you announce ahead of time that you'll only take 1 term? Boy, it will free you up from re-election. The one complaint is, well, but maybe it'll make you a lame duck. People won't take you seriously because they'll just be trying to wait you out. There is some merit to that argument. But you will find it very freeing if you say, okay, I got 4 years, I'm going to do what I can do, get in there and get out. Anyway, keep it in mind.